Hello and welcome back to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Drea Renee Knits, and this is where I try to just answer whatever questions you throw at me. Sometimes I have an opinion, sometimes I have no clue. I try to pick the ones where I have at least a little bit of a clue. Today I am wearing my Spark Cardi, which was my Rhinebeck sweater for the Rhinebeck that never was. This was first year of the pandemic Rhinebeck sweater, but I still wear it with love. You can see it's pretty little details are kind of below my camera angle here, but this is knit up in Magpie Fibers Nest worsted and Spin Cycle Yarns Dream State. So I will, as always, link to this pattern below. This would be a good time. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. Maybe you have coffee or tea or something stronger, like some sparkling fizzy water that my best friend's kids call spicy water because of the bubbles. Anyways, let's focus. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee and we'll jump into some questions. Okay. Let's start. I don't know if I'm telling you or if I'm telling me. Gotta get my head in the game. Okay, question number one. I am so amazed by all of your thoughtfully designed and beautiful patterns. Thank you very much. I have a question about your design process. How do your ideas begin? What is your design process? Do you start with a fabric you like, a yarn you like, a shape? How do you work through the project and how are you able to accomplish so many projects? So it was fun. I feel like I haven't answered any design questions in a while, so I thought this would be kind of a fun way to go back in time. So how do ideas begin? Back in especially my early days, I feel like I got my best ideas when I was nursing my babies because it was like the one time in my life that I could not do anything but sit there. You know? And I like to describe it as almost kind of like that Ratatouille moment, you know, where he's having his brother try whatever delicious morsel they're trying and it's kind of dark and then it's like pop, pop, like fireworks. That's kind of how I feel. Like sometimes I'll just be doing something and then all of a sudden it's like from the depths becomes a sparkle. It's like, ooh, oh, I want to do that. So sometimes it starts like that. Other times, and what happens a lot, as you would be able to see if you go through my design catalog, I love to learn new things. And so when I am feeling maybe like a little creatively dry or just, yeah, like, okay, I'm ready for something new. I need a new spark. I will sit down with a pile of yarn, and it's a great thing to keep like all your odds and ends for, is what I do, is then I use those for my swatching, to just try out new stitches. So I love to just grab a stack of my stitch dictionaries and start playing with ideas. Sorry, a little bit of an itchy nose there. Some of my absolute go-to stitch dictionaries that I pull out all the time. Oh, you can't see. I could probably tilt this up a little. Can I? No? Let's, come on, you silly thing. There we go. There's some books up there. Do you see the red and blue spine? So those are, hopefully now we don't have a big bright thing happening. Those are Barbara Walker's stitch dictionaries, and I would say that those are probably like my all-time favorite. I turn to them a lot. And then I'll just start playing around. I actually did this the other day. Let's see if I have any I can show you. So I gave myself just the other day a little research and development day. It is hard for me to take the time to do it. Especially because this year I just feel like I am a little behind. I like to be a few patterns ahead. I usually release about a pattern a month, and I just feel like last year was like 6 months ahead, and now I am like, oh no, I don't have anything for next month. And that just keeps, I'm just kind of scrambling this year. So it makes it really hard to take that time to slow down. But I'm also, then I finally do, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have like 5 new ideas and I'm so excited. So that is another way that they start, is I just pull out a stitch dictionary and I start playing. This is one of those swatches. Here's another one. This is double brioche, which I just used in a pattern that you may be able to see a little peek of down there. But this is so much fun. So I actually need to film a tutorial for that, like today. But that is also very fun. Another little swatch, playing with colors for an upcoming cardigan. This is also going to be for a cardigan. There's another one. This is a really interesting texture. It looks completely different on the two sides. And then there's one more, but I can't show. So that is another way that the design idea might start, is I start playing with some kind of fun stitch. And a lot of times I fall in love with the stitch, and then that will inspire many a pattern. So as you may have seen with like fading or my shifting series, brioche, I use a lot of brioche or mosaic. So a lot of times I just fall in love with either a technique or a specific stitch pattern that I just want to try and see how I can manipulate it in lots of different ways. So that's kind of how the ideas begin. As far as the design process, it really depends on what I'm doing. So I will decide whether or not I want to do a shawl or a sweater. I have talked on here, I'm always looking for balance in my life. So a lot of times I like to have something a little more like interesting, a little more dynamic, something that takes a little bit more of my brain power. And then I like to balance it out with something maybe a little simpler, a little more relaxing. You know, sometimes like after I do something with color work, I'm like, okay, I need a break from color work. Now I want to jump into something else. Or I just did a shawl and graded it for 10 sizes. And now I want to sweater. And now I just want to do a shawl and maybe offer 2 sizes or whatever it may be. So I'm always kind of flowing with that, kind of seeking out balance in my own life for my creativity. But there's other things that go into that as well. I just lost my train of thought, I'm not gonna lie. Where was I gonna go with that? Darn it. I do not typically start with fabric or drape or anything like that. I think part of that is kind of knowing, having done this for long enough, I kind of know how to get the fabric or drape I might want with any given yarn and needle combination. I will definitely try it out, but usually the idea is a little further along. And yeah, I'll make sure I still love it, but I can kind of have an idea. How do you work through the project, and how are you able to accomplish so many projects? It's interesting because I do get that. I have people tell me that it seems like I do a lot. I don't feel that way, especially right now. I'm like, I want to do so much and there's just not enough time in the day. But you know, I do have my workday organized in a way where usually I use like my strongest brain power in the morning for like emails, grading, writing patterns, etc. And the second half of my day, I try to gift myself knitting time. So yeah, and I'm just always doing it. I mean, this is my full-time job, so I guess that's how I get done as much as I get done. And yeah, I mean, there are other things that will determine what I'm working on as well. Like every year I do a Rhinebeck sweater. I also do a hat for my hat weekend knit along challenge in May, and then I do socks for my sock knit along challenge in November. So those are like 3 anchors I have throughout the year, and then from there it's really just whatever sparks joy. I would say that is like my leading thing when I am trying, when I'm filling in all those other gaps of things that aren't like, this is what I do every like May and blah blah blah. So I look at like, okay, what would I love to see in my wardrobe, and what would be really fun to knit right now. Like right now I've been on a shawl kick, so I just finished 2 shawls in the past month, and that's been really, really fun. I feel like I've been on such a sweater kick for so long, it's kind of nice to switch it up. So yeah, that was a really rambly answer, because it's very, I guess that's just what my design process is. It's kind of like this, where it's just, well, let's see what would make me feel happy, what I feel like is lacking in my wardrobe, and what I want to see on my needles. So there you go. There was an answer somewhere in there. Yet another gauge question. I say bring them on. I think that the more we talk about gauge, the better. And I thought that this was a great question. So this is an English style knitter, and they always seem to have to go up two needles sizes or so to make gauge. However, I feel that in doing so, my stitches look looser than the fabric looks in the pattern. If I'm making gauge, is this the same stitch fabric the designer intended? I'm trying to word this question as best as I can. I think you worded it beautifully. So this is where yarn substitutions kind of come into play, and really thinking about the yarn that was used in the pattern and how whatever yarn you're using may differ from that one. So, you know, you can kind of try and like zoom in on some of those photos and see if their fabric looks as open as yours. But it's really interesting because there are certain yarns, you know, they might all be labeled, let's say fingering weight, but I have in my stash lots of yarn that is labeled fingering weight, but they have a very different weight to yardage ratio. And so one skein of fingering weight does not equal another skein of fingering weight, and also whatever that yarn is made up of. So there are some yarns that are really gonna bloom and fluff and fill in after blocking, and then there are others that are just gonna grow and become drapier. So I think if you're feeling like your fabric looks a lot different than the pattern photos, that probably has to do with your yarn. So if you're getting stitch gauge, that means that you should technically end up, and not just stitch gauge, but if you're getting gauge, then you should technically end up with the correct measurements at the end of your project. But it does need to be a fabric you like. So if you don't like how open that looks, you might want to play around with maybe different yarns. Maybe that's just not the best yarn substitution. But remember too that like if you like a fabric with a lot of drape, then that's fine. Definitely make sure you're wet blocking your swatch, because it can just change so drastically. Again, you can see this little peak of the shawl on the floor, and I should have taken a picture of it when it was wrapped around me right after I had bound off. Right after I had finished, it was, I don't want to say stiff because it wasn't stiff, but it was very tight compared to what it is now. Like the blocking process changed it so much. Now it's very flowy and drapey and soft and just wants to be wrapped around, where before it was just kind of like sitting high up. It had a lot of volume. So just remember, knit a big swatch and wet block it to see how that fabric changes, because that might be the difference. Especially if you're using the recommended yarn. You know, I'm just making a big old assumption that you subbed a different yarn because I'm trying to figure out like why it would look different. And so that could just be the difference between their blocked finished piece and your swatch if you hadn't blocked it. So anyways, there's some ideas to kind of try out. Next question. I have heard you talk about how much you love and recommend interchangeable needles. So this came up a few times after last week's episode, where I said the one tool I wish, something along the lines of like the one tool I wish I had known when I first started knitting, and for me it's interchangeable needles. A number of you were saying you have tried interchangeable needles, but your biggest frustration is that they come unscrewed. So I absolutely know what you're talking about. I do not have, oh, every time. Thankfully, I have another set of needles right here, and I think I need to see if I have them here. So basically, here's the deal with the interchangeable needles I like. My favorites, as I have said, are, I really love Chaogu for their metal tips, and then I really like the Luca for wooden tips. So these ones are my wooden tips. These ones are indigo dyed. I also have these, which just like make me so happy if I can get it out of my case. Come here, little needle tip. Well, for heaven's sake. They're pink. Aren't they so cute? Okay. Anyways, I digress. So I prefer screw-in interchangeable needles. So you can see here that there is, do you see that hole right there by my pointer finger? So that is where you are going to want to insert your little key. Depending on the needle type, they might have one of these cute little, there's a helicopter going by my house right now. It just looks like a little pin. In the Chiaogus, it's literally just a T-pin. But you're gonna put that pin through that hole. You can't see it. Through the hole. And then you need a little rubber pad, and you need to use that pad to twist and tighten. A great tip, I have shown this before, and the best tip ever, somebody was like, you know, you can just use a rubber band. So like for instance, our broccoli a lot of times comes with like a wide rubber band around the stalks. And so I keep those, and they do such a good job. So you can totally just like go look at your produce. If any of it has a rubber band on it, steal it and just lock that tip on. For me, I cannot get these tips off without then using the pin and the rubber tip to then undo them. So that's how well that locks on. But I do think you need to use both to secure them, and then they won't untwist, because you do not want your needle tips coming untwisted. You know, there's also different interchangeable needles. You might like Addy clicks, which just click in, although you do have to be careful depending on, some people push like their needle tips as they knit. You don't want to push, and if you push and accidentally twist, you could pop off a needle tip. But you might want to try Addy clicks. The reason I love like the Chiaogu so much is this join right here where the cord meets the tip, the metal, is so smooth and seamless. I cannot stand when there is a lip right there that my stitches get caught on, and I feel like I have to one by one push them up and over that lip. It drives me bonkers. So that is, I have tried most interchangeable needles out there, and these are the ones that I ended up sticking with at the end of the day. There was also some great tips about how you can buy individual cords and needle tips. I think I had mentioned sometime in the video that if you want extras of a certain size, you could do that. But I loved the idea that some people shared of, before you invest in a whole set, you can even invest in just a couple cords and tips to make sure you like them. And I thought that was such a great idea. So that's something to think about too. And, you know, if you have a knitting group or some knitting buddies, see what they're using and ask them to borrow. Just even like a little swatch. You know, sometimes even I've gone to some yarn stores where they will have little swatches on needles, so you can try out the needles they sell at the shop. Like that's where I tried out the Cubics ones before that are square. And so some people like those. Some people say they help with knitting tension. There's just so much out there. So if you ever have the opportunity to try something out, I recommend doing that. But that is how you fix that issue, is some kind of rubber and the key through the hole and lock it. All right. I see your patterns use wrap and turn rather than German short rows. Is there a reason? When attempting to learn various short row construction types, I found German to be the easiest. What's your opinion on short rows and reasons for using one type versus another? I'm gonna take another sip of my coffee. I love that I bring my coffee up as though I'm gonna have time to be sipping on it while I do this. But there is no opportunity because I'm the only one talking. But I still, it just feels nice. Okay, so short rows are my favorite example to use of why it's so great to be a knitter, because we really have the opportunity with so many different techniques in knitting to use the method that feels best for us, that clicks the easiest with our unique brain and that feels the best in our hands. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do so many of the techniques we use. Short rows is my favorite example of that. There are so many different kinds of short rows. So I highly recommend you find out which version you like best, because a lot of them are fairly easy to interchange within a pattern. I default to wrap and turn short rows in my patterns just because they're the most widely known. And so it's more of just like an accessibility thing for that most people are already kind of comfortable with the wrap and turn. But I'm going to link again. I have linked it before, but Carol Feller does a free short row class that I took like 8 years ago, 10 years, a long time ago. But it's on Craftsy, it's free, and it is so brilliant. And it teaches you a number of different ways to work short rows. So just give them a try. I really love Japanese short rows where you use a locking stitch marker. There's also like shadow wrap. There's a yarn over version. I have done German short rows, but it has been years, and to be honest, I don't remember how. I should look it up, because I do think, and I do highly recommend trying the German version, because that's what I get the most feedback on. Is a lot of people love German short rows and ask if they can swap that in. So definitely check those out for any of you short row newbies or trying to find the method you like, because that seems to be very well loved. So there you go. All right. Okay, this question comes up pretty often. Newsletter. I've been signed up for your newsletter almost forever, and suddenly it stopped coming. What do I do? Basically is the question here about the newsletter. This person sneaked in an extra question. So I'm going to go back to that in a second. But for the newsletter part, I don't know why, but our email spam filters are just a little too aggressive. And there will be people who have been on my newsletter list forever, getting them just fine, and then all of a sudden they don't. I don't know where the glitch is happening. I use MailChimp as my newsletter service provider, if you will. And I'll go look and like it says they're being delivered, but sometimes people don't get them. So my tips for newsletter glitches is make sure that my email address is in your contact list, because that should help your over-aggressive spam filter not filter me out of there when I send my newsletters. Always check all of your spam, junk, and promotional folders, because sometimes it's just not making it all the way into your inbox. And then if nothing else works, also sometimes my newsletter goes out almost every week, but there is once in a blue moon where I take a week or two away from it, depending on how busy the behind the scenes stuff is. So kind of keep that in mind. It may just be that I didn't put out a newsletter for the week or two and you were like, oh, am I not getting them anymore? But there just wasn't one. But if you are sure you are not receiving it, you can always email me. And I have found a way to kind of make it work through MailChimp without, because once you start unsubscribing and resubscribing, I think that can get all messed up. So worst comes to worst, if none of those other fixes help, just shoot me an email and I will message you through their system, and that seems to fix it. Next question. This person lives in a very warm Australian climate, but it has started to get colder. So they want to learn brioche knitting to keep me warmer. Question 1, is brioche fabric much thicker than a garment made with ordinary stocking stitch? Yes, it is. Brioche is technically a double fabric. So think of it as two ribbed fabrics back to back. So it's also quite a bit heavier. And question 2, can any weight of yarn be used? Yes, any weight yarn can be used. You can even combine different weights into brioche. One thing to consider as well is you can also just utilize some woolen spun yarns in whatever patterns you're working, whether they be brioche or not, and those are going to be warmer than something knit with a worsted spun yarn, because woolen spun yarns have air in their core, and as your body warms up that air, it insulates us, and it's very, very warm. All right, last question for today. How do you get out of a knitting slump / sleeve island? I have a few unfinished projects that I've completely lost interest in, but I feel guilty about having them lie around. How can I work up the motivation to pick them up again? So, a couple things here. Have you lost interest in them because maybe they're not turning out the way you wanted? Like, don't be afraid. I do try, I think all of us, I am really jumping around with this answer. I think all of us have probably had that project that like you're knitting on and you keep setting it down. And you knit like 2 stitches and then all of a sudden you set it down. And you're just not moving forward on it. Usually I find that there's this little inner voice called our intuition that is saying there's something not quite right about the project. Sometimes it is totally worth it to push through, especially because our projects can change so much after a good blocking. But sometimes we also just know this project isn't working out. So if those projects just aren't working out, or maybe you thought you would like the yarn you're using, but you don't, or you don't like the pattern, or whatever it is, life's too short. If you're not enjoying it and you don't like it and you're not going to utilize the finished object, frog it, in my opinion. But if you are like, no, I do like it, I just don't want to knit the sleeves, that's a different story. I actually don't feel sleeve island issues because for me, I just feel like they go so much faster than the body or the yoke of the sweater that I'm like, look at me go. I also find the second sleeve to be much more relaxing than the first. The first sleeve is when I have to pay attention and figure out how to space my decreases if it's top down or increases if it's bottom up. So then on my second sleeve, I just get to replicate it. So that's like really easy breezy. So that's one way to think about it is, okay, I'm going to do the first sleeve. I got to pay attention, but then I'm just going to breeze through the second sleeve. Another idea, if you're knitting, depending on the type of style of sweater you're knitting, if it is bottom up, knit the sleeves first. That way you can't get stuck on sleeve island because they are done. They also can make a pretty good swatch. Keeping in mind that sometimes we knit smaller circumference tighter than larger circumference. So keep that in mind. If you're knitting top down, you can put the body on hold, knit the sleeves, and then go back to the body. Another way to get out of a knitting slump is to do the joy questions. So look at your yarn, look at your queue of patterns, do some, like if you have any hashtags you like to follow or Pinterest boards or wherever you find, like where you might like to see some inspiration, and just ask yourself, like, what would make me the happiest? Like if it's just a knitting slump and not necessarily sleeve island, you might just need something that like brings you back to your joyful place of knitting. Like, why do you knit? Is it because you want a handmade wardrobe? Is it because it fills you up and it's really meditative and it relaxes you through life's ups and downs? I think asking yourself those questions so you can kind of come back to a place of like, why do I like to do this? And what project would most reconnect me with that feeling? Because, circling back, life's too short to knit things we don't want to knit. So for me as well, things that kind of circling all the way back to that first question of how do I get so many projects done and things like that, I knit things that excite me and that are hard to put down. So that includes different stitches that are just really fun to work, or color. Like most of my patterns do involve some form of color, and that is because I'm so excited to watch what's happening with those colors playing together that I do not want to put it down. It's very much that like, oh, just do one more row. I'm just gonna do one more row, where it's just so much fun. So I think finding for you what gives you that fun. And don't forget too that if you're knitting a sweater, let's say, you can add in your own fun. Like you could add in a really sweet little color work detail around the cuff that might get you excited to knit through that sleeve, so you can do that little bit of color work. And then you're also making that sweater completely your own and different than any of the others that are out there. So there you go. Okay. As always, you will find some links below for information, the questions I answered, things that we chatted about. I should put those Barbara Walker books in the links. You remember last week when I was all on top of this, I was like, I even have a piece of paper to write this down. All right, BW Stitch pattern books. Okay, we do have the DRK March to May knit along for sweaters and shawls going on. All of those links are below. Our DRK Spin It to Knit It knit along is almost done. I don't have any spinning to show today. I got to surprise my best friend, who has been my best friend since the day I was born. I got to take her on a surprise trip. I was about to like start explaining. I just decided that's not necessary. But anyways, I got to take her on a little trip this past weekend, which was so fun. But I didn't get to do any spinning. I just was doing knitting. So hopefully I will be back with some spinning next week to show off. I'm just so busy right now. I got to catch up on these patterns. I got to design some more patterns for all y'all. Yeah, so I guess I don't really have any show and tell or anything, but definitely jump over into the knit along. We would love to have you join. And if you haven't peeked at Instagram this week, I just posted a sneak peek of my new shawls coming out in just over a week. So my hand spun shawl, and I also knit it up in some commercial yarns so you could see it both ways. We just did the photo shoot yesterday, so that is going to be coming out very soon, and they would be great to jump into the knit along with, the shawl knit along. All right, I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you to each and every one of you who commented on the last video that marked 1 year of doing these. I so appreciated reading through all of your comments. They were so sweet. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. And I'll see you back here next week. Happy knitting.